I think we are ready to begin. It is about 2 minutes after 5 o'clock, so the official time has begun. We have a lot to do today, multiple presentations. This is actually a panel discussion, but it's more than a panel discussion. We have actually multiple different presentations on different topics, all of which I find extremely interesting. At least I find them all extremely interesting, and hopefully we'll have an interesting discussion about how all of these things come together in the end. So let me say first, good evening, and welcome to the second and final installment of this Premodern symposium with our guest, David Frye. Together with the Modern Contemporary Symposium that's going to be taking place in November, on the 13th and 14th of November, taken together with that, the title of this two-part academic event is Border Walls, Firewalls, Seawalls, Global Cultural Resources as Limits. By limits and walls, I mean generally particular kinds of convergence between maximums and minimums, between abundances and lacks, between eternities and immediacies, between chaos and order. The list goes on. But in every case, the remarkable thing to me about limits as walls and walls as limits is the idea of a kind of convergence of seeming opposites that is occurring at that very site or that very point where the limit is, or the wall is, so to speak. One other quick remark I'd like to make before we get going is something I've taken away from Professor Frye's lecture last night and the workshop earlier today. And it is that we need to try to understand walls as tools. And as I think a particular, perhaps somewhat unique kind of tool that keeps on working and doing things after we've made it, hopefully the thing we wanted it to do. But once it's out there, it is actually a creation that then itself begins to create a new landscape, a new reality in that landscape. So while we tend perhaps to see walls as ends of things, perhaps, a question we should always perhaps ask ourselves is, to what degree are walls actually beginnings? So these are just a couple of general reflections on walls as cultural limits, so to speak. I want to be brief with what I say because we have so much to do and so many people actually speaking today. So I will briefly thank the agencies that have made this symposium possible. They're listed in materials that I can give to you. Remote viewers can find these online at the UF Song's website. I will mention the three sources in particular that have been instrumental. The Imagineering and Technosphere Mellon Intersections Group, the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany, and UF's Imagining Climate Change Initiative. And since I'm thanking people right now, I very, very much want to thank besides thanking our guest scholar for coming down to from Connecticut, I want to thank UF colleagues who have been willing to spend time and to devote some effort to presenting today. This event, like the one last night, is carried by the Sustainable Online Network for Global Cultural Studies. If you found the link to this live stream, then right next to that link you should be able to find the link with instructions on how to ask questions and be involved in the Q&A later on. We had our first successes in that area with a lecture yesterday. We had a number of questions coming for Dr. Frye's lecture, and it would be great if we had some more participation from our remote audience this evening. In the interest, again, of expediency and getting things started, so as to leave the maximum time later on for Q&A, I'd like to introduce the speakers in the order in which they will be making their brief, circa 10-minute presentations. David Frye, who is our guest, professor of ancient and medieval history at Eastern Connecticut State University. We'll invite him to say the first few words and perhaps set the stage for us a little bit. Then, in succession, I would ask my UF colleagues Eleni Bozia of Classics, Nina Caputo of History, Florin Curta of History, Ashley Jones of Art History, and Richard Wong of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures to make their presentations. Mary Watt is the co-director of Medieval and Early Modern Studies. She will be coming along. She had something else that she had to attend to, but she wants to come along and be involved in the discussion at the end, in the Q&A part of the discussion at the end. So that's her designated seat right there. So I think we are ready to get started. So with that, without further ado, I will invite David to get things started.
All right, thank you, Will. I'll try to keep it brief and try to move things along too. Will asked me to introduce the theme tonight, and I have to admit the first example that came to my mind as exemplifying this theme wasn't Premodern. So I'm going to beg your indulgence here for just maybe about 2 minutes while I began in 1961. And so even when I say that year, probably a number of you in the room already know where I'm starting. So in the 15 years or 16 years after the Second World War, the Soviet bloc countries of Eastern Europe lost something on the order of 4 million citizens fleeing to the West. Joseph Stalin in the 1940s erected barriers on the borders of Hungary and Eastern Germany, which were intended to stem that flow. But there remained, of course, one major flaw in the system, and that was Berlin. Berlin was the hole in the dike. It was a place where people could still pass fairly freely between East and West. Daily commuting was still occurring, and shoppers could cross from East to West. And by 1961, it was clear that that was, the go-to escape route, that it was a problem that would need to be dealt with. And it was an issue that was coming to a head. Nikita Khrushchev warned that there would be a thermonuclear response if the Western Allies didn't withdraw from West Berlin. So on August 13th, 1961, the people of Berlin awakened to the rumble and roar of machinery as East German police and soldiers poured out of their barracks, rolled out miles of barbed wire, lowered concrete slabs into place, and that was the beginning of the Berlin Wall. Barbed Wire Sunday, as that day was known, was heavily publicized in the West, or by the Western news media. Within days, the Berlin Wall had become something more than simply a physical barrier intended to prevent the passage of citizens from East Germany into the West. It had become, for a lot of people in the West, a symbol of the evils of communism, a system so terrible that it had to imprison its own people. The figure of the Berlin Wall had merely to show up in movies, countless movies, and on television for people to be reminded of that particular point. 28 years later, in November of 1989, the Berlin Wall fell in an event which was televised live around the world. For several days, the Berlin Wall commanded the news cycle. And then in something of a foreshadowing of just how short our attention spans were becoming, the Berlin Wall started to, well, it quickly faded from popular consciousness. The networks quickly learned that specials about the Berlin Wall were ratings killers. Collectors who had hoped to impress people by having large sections of the Berlin Wall in their living rooms learned that they just had an ugly living room, and that the piece of concrete that they had there was completely without value. And in time, a generation of students entered our classrooms that had no personal recollection of the Berlin Wall and very little awareness of the Berlin Wall, or when or why, or it had been built, or what it had once represented. Now, I imagine the Berlin Wall would have continued its slide into oblivion, except for the events of 2015, when the Trump campaign raised the issues of walls, again in a very prominent way. The Berlin Wall had another moment. It was figuratively revived to serve as a symbol yet again, except it would no longer be a symbol for the evils of communism. It would now be viewed by a great many people as a symbol for the evil of all walls. So I wanted to start with the Berlin Wall, even though it wasn't pre-modern, so it doesn't exactly fit our little panel today, because I think it is the simplest way to introduce the subject of today's panel, which is the literal and figurative uses of walls. When Walter Ulbricht ordered the construction of the Berlin Wall, I can assure you, he never intended that that wall was to serve as a symbol for the evils of communism. And I can also assure you that he never intended or even imagined that that wall would serve as a symbol for the evil of all walls. And when I think about that, I think that for me, the Berlin Wall, and when I say for me, I mean as a researcher of walls, the Berlin Wall has become a kind of personal symbol. It has become for me a reminder from a time when there is an almost infinite amount of sources, that when we are addressing the very poorly sourced walls of the pre-modern period, that we have to be careful with our speculations. When I see the Berlin Wall now, I'm reminded that a wall is just an object. And like any object, it can be viewed as a symbol of anything by anyone at any time. And the figurative uses of a wall, like the figurative uses of any object, are often completely divorced from the intended literal function of the wall or object. Moreover, a wall might have a primary and a secondary intended function, but even those functions can be viewed very differently by different sets of people at different times. So, when I think of pre-modern walls, I have to say that the study of pre-modern walls remains very much in its infancy. Pre-modern walls tend to be dealt with as asides in longer works that are dealing with other larger topics. And I think a lot of that has to do with the paucity of sources on pre-modern walls. There was something about ancient walls which, unlike the Berlin Wall, very much went without saying. When, the Berlin Wall became a cause célèbre because Western news correspondents were there on August 13, 1961, taking photographs and taking film. And they knew they had a story that they could sensationalize. They'd never sensationalized the borders of Hungary and the borders of East Germany, but they had an opportunity in 1961 and they ran with it. There's never any sort of sensationalism attached to pre-modern city walls or even border walls. And even our sources on them are, as I say, quite thin. Now, one reason I think that the sources are so thin is frankly the ubiquity of walls in the pre-modern world. Walls were, in the main, routine. The primary type of pre-modern wall was the city wall. And city walls were very nearly universal. A city in the ancient world was, by and large, a thing with walls. There are exceptions. Those exceptions occurred, by and large, when it was thought that some imperial walls or other imperial border defense might obviate the need for city walls. But even those exceptions tended to be temporary. An example, I know I have some classicists in here today, I think. Example of that would be, in the early Roman Empire, when there were quite a number of cities without walls. That was a very unusual thing. And it ceased to be the case after the failure of the Roman imperial borders in the 3rd century AD. After which the Roman army seems to have gone from city to city, tearing down theaters and baths and other public monuments in order to claim the stone and use it to build city walls. And so all of those cities were re-walled. Similarly, I know we have an expert on Ming history and the Ming walls here today, and we know that the Ming had to reestablish all the city walls in China after the Mongols had briefly done away with them. Cities continued to be walled as a matter of routine. Right up until the point when gunpowder finally rendered walls militarily obsolete. And even then, there were efforts that went on for quite some time to develop or engineer a type of wall that would prolong the usefulness of the city wall. But once those efforts had failed, once artillery had achieved superiority over walls, city walls fade very quickly from the landscape, and no one subsequently built walls, city walls, for any other purpose. No one constructed city walls in order to serve as a symbol for the city. Not surprisingly, the sheer ubiquity of walls did spawn certain figurative uses. And, I'll just mention a couple of obvious ones. In ancient and medieval maps, cities are often represented by the figure of walls. We might also see a city issue coins or medallions in which the city is rendered as a set of walls. And this makes sense. A pre-modern city, viewed from the outside, would present itself as a set of walls. And so I think because the walls in any given region, the city walls in any given region, would have looked, similarly. It would be easy enough to adopt them figuratively as the representation of a city. Of course, we also see in literature that walls might symbolize the greatness of a city. You could see that famously in the Gilgamesh epic or in Homer's descriptions of Troy. Walls might also figure in the religions or myths associated with cities. For example, in China, an early word for the term for a city god literally translates into English as God of the Wall and Moat. So a decade from now, I hope we're able to say a lot more, generally speaking, about the figurative roles of pre-modernists. But as I say, the sources are thin and scattered, and when they're images rather than words, they're especially vulnerable to speculation. In which case, I hope we can remember the example of the Berlin Wall and how the same wall can represent different things to different people at different times. And how the figurative uses of a wall could be utterly disconnected from the literal function of a wall. So I'm looking forward to tonight's papers, and I think it sounds like they're going to be a great start. So.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for coming, and I will thank you for inviting me to participate. So the series of events that our colleague Will Hasty has so creatively put together are meant to commemorate the fall of the Berlin Wall, an event from the recent past that will always signify the fluidity and absurdity of geography and the effectuations of social constructions in the form of an actual wall. It took 30-something years to tear down the wall. And still, 30 years later, the wall is hidden in phrases such as former DDR, Deutsche Demokratische Republik, and former East and West Germany. No one can underestimate or even attempt to downplay the implications of the wall on the national and international stages, and more importantly, on human lives. Socially and politically intrusive as East Germany suffered while West Germany experienced its economic miracle, its Wirtschaftswunder. John F. Kennedy declared after its election, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I'm a citizen of Berlin, implying a sense of transnational unity that extends beyond geography. And Ronald Reagan, addressing Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in June of 1987, urged him to tear down this wall. The wall signified division. However, for the citizens of the Roman Empire, their walls really did include the majority of the then known world. One only needed to proclaim that he was a Roman citizen and his safety would be guaranteed. Cicero preserves the phrase, civis Romanus sum, I'm a citizen of Rome, which eerily precedes JFK's words. And it was a verbal passport, if you will, used by a Roman official in the provinces, as well as by Paul the Apostle, when he was apprehended and claimed his right to be tried by Caesar. Taking us back quite literally, since I actually used Oculus to use Google Earth, taking us back through the centuries, the first wall was the Servian Wall, constructed around the city of Rome in the early 4th century BCE. The wall was named after the 6th Roman king Servius Tullius, who was of Etruscan descent, hence a foreigner. So despite the use, and let's start taking a look, so that I would be able to move closer. So despite the use of the wall to ward off enemies, the inclusiveness of the Romans did in fact admit non-Romans to their early history. The Servian wall was formidable enough to repel Hannibal during the Second Punic War. The wall was still maintained through the end of the late Republic and then the Empire. By this time, Rome had already begun to grow outside the Servian wall, and the organization was under regions according to Augustus. So the Servian wall, I remember, was maintained there as a commemoration of that part of Rome's history. Sections of the Servian wall still survive today, and they are visible in various locations in Rome, one next to Stazione Termini, and a part of the wall is within McDonald's dining area. And you will see pretty soon, it will zoom in and you will see that part of the wall. And there is also one in Piazza Albania along Viale Aventino. I was able on my PowerPoint to move faster, the video faster, but I cannot do it here. The other one in Piazza Albania. Hadrian's Wall now. We are moving outside of Rome, and I'm going to be taking you across the city of Rome and beyond Rome. Hadrian's Wall was a defensive fortification in the Roman province of Britannia, began in 122 CE in the reign of Emperor Hadrian. It ran from the banks of River Tyne near the North Sea to the Solway Firth of the Irish Sea, and was the northern limit of the Roman Empire. The largest Roman archaeological feature in Britain that ran a total of 73 miles in northern England. For Hadrian, it represented his wish to keep his empire intact, an empire that had been imposed on him via the so-called divine instruction. He also had constructed, you can see parts of the wall, and now let me move you to Hadrian's wall, or parts of it that still survive. He had also constructed limits, and I'm glad that Will brought up limits and boundaries before, in other areas of the empire. The limites of Rome were never expected to stop any tribes from migrating or actually armies from invading. And the economic viability of actually constructing and maintaining a wall 73 miles long along a sparsely populated area is dubious, to say the least. Limites did not strictly mark the boundaries of the empire. Roman power and influence often extended beyond the walls, and people within and beyond the limites traveled through it every day conducting business. And most of these small limites points were used for taxation. Another theory that is far more reasonable is that Hadrian's Wall was constructed in order to reflect the power of Rome. Antoninus Pius, and here we have even less surviving, Antoninus Pius attempted to top off Hadrian and expand the borders of the Roman Empire to the north. His efforts, of course, were unsuccessful, and here it's a part of the wall in Glasgow, in Scotland, that still survives, and it's literally next to nothing. Now, going back to the city of Rome, and you will see why all this back and forth, since I want to play with not only walls, with border walls and with borders in general. The Aurelian walls are a line of city walls built between 271 and 275 CE in Rome under the reign of Aurelius. The walls enclosed all 7 hills of Rome, plus the Campus Martius, and on the left bank of the Tiber, the Trastevere district. The construction project was unusually left to the citizens themselves to complete. Now that you got a closer look, let me move to Aurelian walls, of which we actually have more surviving. So it was left to the citizens themselves to complete, as Aurelian could not afford to spare any money or any legionaries to construct the wall. Progress was accelerated and money saved by incorporating existing buildings into the structure. And these included the Amphitheatrum Castrense, the Castra Praetoria, the Pyramid of Cestius that I have coming up next, and even a section of Appia Claudia near the Porta Maggiore. As much as a sixth of these walls is estimated to have been composed of pre-existing structures. This is the actual wall as we are moving using Google Earth, and we are literally seeing the wall, and the Pyramid of Cestius, and it's going to zoom in a minute. The Aurelian walls continued as a significant military defense of the city of Rome until actually September of 1870. Now, these are the technical aspects of an empire that was understandably described as an imperium sine fine, an empire without end. What about the life within this area, though? Citizenry of the empire, instead of inoculating themselves and protecting their Romanes, embraced multilingualism and multiculturalism. Citizenship was granted to everyone by Emperor Caracalla in 212 CE, and the empire consisted of native Romans, who were fluent in both, obviously, Latin and Greek, Greeks who were Roman citizens, and other Easterners who were naturalized Romans and potentially trilingual. And you can see here from above the area around the Pyramid of Cestius. Favorinus is, if we want to take a closer look at this walled-in, and I'm using this both literally and figuratively, area of the city and of the empire, geographical borders were pretty much defined. We saw Hadrian's Wall, we had the Servian Wall, Aurelian walls, etc. At the same time, however, Hadrian created the Panhellenion that was to determine the Greekness of cities. So cultural past and present vie for a plain geography. Additionally, exilic literature, which praises and questions the very concept of exile, creates a different kind of inclusive geography, a cosmopolitan sense of locality and belonging. And now, Favorinus' proclamation, the 2nd century CE, he devoted an entire work on the exile. Comprehensively summarizes this very concept, ancestral ties, yet dynamic quality of provenance and belonging. I too love my fatherland, my love is second to no one's, and I should never have left it willingly. On reflection, however, I discovered that it is nothing other than the place in which my forebears settled or resided. That the fatherland is not the country in which we ourselves were born is clear from the following. Many people, though born in one place, regard another land as their fatherland. Similarly, and even before Favorinus, Cicero, in a dialogue between Atticus and Marcus, redefines the concept of homeland and argues that a man can have two patriae, one by birth and one by citizenship. And later, Aelius Aristides, which, not surprisingly, but very reasonably enough, in his Encomium to Rome, actually redefines entirely geographical space against the backdrop of citizenship and argues for a meritorious evaluation in a global market of citizenry. And you can see here neither the sea nor any distance on land shuts a man out of citizenship. And then later on, the constitution is a universal democracy. The case of Lucian, and now we are moving out and in and all together again within the Roman Empire, is a 2nd century CE sophist/orator, is very intriguing. He was born in Samosata, the former kingdom of Commagene, which he describes occasionally as Syria or Assyria, so he is, I guess, undecided. Was a naturalized Roman, but he wrote in Greek. He dedicated his entire work, A Sleeping Tongue in Greeting, to self-flagellation because of a linguistic mistake when greeting someone when he used health instead of joy to you. And it's actually quite extensive. Not only does he not make any excuses, but also makes sure to give an entire list of occurrences of both phrases, all the while showcasing that he is fluent in both Greek language and Greek cultural norms, along with the Roman ones, and simply describes this as an unfortunate moment. Still, the point remains the same. We have someone who brings to the front that he is using Greek as a secondary language, while he is serving in the Roman administration. Favorinus, whom I mentioned before, is a naturalized Roman himself. However, he is from Gaul, and as far as we can tell, he is fluent in 3 languages, so he's a trilingual. Favorinus considers himself fully Hellenized, and he actually suggests that he does not only, and this is a quote verbatim, he does not only wish to seem Greek, he wants to be Greek, whatever that means. While Gellius, a Roman author that was contemporary of Favorinus, says about Favorinus that it is because of him that the Latin language proved to be far ahead from the Greek. So entirely naturalized Gaul, Roman and Greek through language. Now, to bring us closer to the Berlin Wall, Peter Snyder in his book Wall Jumper, A Berlin Story, says that, quote, "If the Germans still have a fatherland, it survives mostly in the mother tongue. And if it is true that land comes from our father and language from our mother, then our maternal heritage has proved far stronger. After all, the word Deutsch originally referred neither to a nation nor to a state. It meant people and of the people, and designated the common language of various tribes." Finally, and I told you I will keep bringing you on purpose and not because I'm disorganized back and forth, Claudius, another Roman emperor, made a case for Gauls to be admitted to the Roman Senate, as they have fought for the Romans, albeit technically foreigners. And this is his proclamation that survives as the so-called Leon tablet, and it was found over there in La Croix-Rousse. Now, what about everyday life? A tombstone that was recently found in South Shields in the UK features an inscription that is in Latin and Palmyran. Bastratis, originally from Palmyra, set up an epitaph for his wife Regina. And you can see, I don't know if it's clear, but the Latin on top, the Palmyran on the bottom. So the Roman walls as we know them did not necessarily signify division, but rather protection and an unprecedented internationalization, fostering cultural syncretism. Similarly, the walls since then have been incorporated into modern Roman life, much like the so-called SPQR, the Senatus Populusque Romanus, that features everywhere in Rome. And the walls themselves had been used for triumphal and papal passages, and this is one example of Piazza Esquilina. Parts of history, both the walls and their gates, that does not only belong to the Romans but to the world, and monuments to the need for globalism and localism, embracing the world while being mindful of the individual. and another part that may be more well known, the Porta del Popolo in Piazza del Popolo next to Santa Maria del Popolo. To close, we cannot claim that the expansion of the Roman Empire was in any way peaceful. Corinth was razed to the ground and rebuilt, and literature presents the event as a rebirth through both Greekness and Romanesque. Similarly, as Karl Scheffer wrote about Berlin in 1910, Berlin ist eine Stadt verdammt dazu, Weg zu werden, niemals zu sein. Berlin is a city condemned forever to becoming and never to being. However, Berlin is one of the most beautiful cities in the world through its continuous rebirth. Roman appreciation, similarly, of local authorities and administration, a respect of Greek language and civilization, and a more inclusive cultural geography, gave us the first sense of globalism with concern for local life. Greek theatres and Roman baths feature in the Far East, bilingual inscriptions, Latin along with any local language really, and Trajan, a Roman emperor of Spanish descent, prove all of cultural rather than national belonging, are all indicative of the fact that indeed all roads do lead to Rome. Connecting the threads of the past and the present, Anneliese Bodecker said about Berlin, quote, Berliners are unfriendly and inconsiderate, gruff and self-righteous. Berlin is off-putting, loud, dirty and grey, with construction sites and congested streets wherever you happen to be or go. But I feel sorry for anyone who can't live there, end of quote. And I personally, having lived there, I wholeheartedly concur. So thank you all for your attention and vielen Dank für diese Gelegenheit.
Well, thank you, Bill, for inviting me, and thank you all for coming out this afternoon. I will be speaking far less concretely about walls, or I should say about walls that are not concrete. And I'm picking up on some of what Lainey was talking about just a moment ago. I'll be talking about cultural walls and how those walls transform over time. The Midrashic tractate Pirkei Avot, or Sayings of the Fathers, opens with the following statement. Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. They said three things: be patient in justice, raise many students, and make a fence around the Torah. In addition to asserting an unbroken chain of tradition, beginning with Moses and leading directly to the rabbis, this passage also lays out a set of principles intended to underscore and preserve the central values of Jewish culture in the diaspora. Central to that is a strong emphasis on educating and socializing an intellectual elite. The call to build a fence around the Torah illustrates the cultural and coercive mechanisms Jews use to maintain a level of social, cultural, and religious distinction, what Jacob Katz called exclusiveness, while living in the diaspora. The term for fence, sig in Hebrew, indicates a physical barrier, but a verdant one, perhaps more like a hedge than a wall. It is commonly understood as a metaphorical security measure, a means of protecting the central precepts of the covenant from corruption and degradation, while encouraging the exegetical culture that invited and celebrated narrative fancy that often riffed on biblical themes and sometimes had a direct influence on interpretations of ritual law and practice. It is precisely this emphasis on cultural distinctiveness that makes traditional Jewish communities in the diaspora Jewish. Jewish diasporic life has been shaped directly by boundaries, both physical and metaphorical, some having been originated from within the Jewish community, others having been imposed on the community by external powers. Venetian ghetto, for example, was established by Christian authorities to define a specifically Jewish space and limit Jews' mobility and freedoms. It was meant to serve as a living reminder that Judaism was culturally and theologically inferior and subservient to Christianity. However, the Venice ghetto proved a fertile ground for the development of distinctly Jewish culture, scholarship, and tradition that were they were directly in dialogue with dominant cultures of Venice. Indeed, the founding of the ghetto in Venice recognized a space for Jews as a permanent part of the city, thus providing the foundation for a stable and multifaceted Venetian Jewish culture. Here, the combination of a distinct physical space in which Judaism thrived facilitated a relatively untroubled passage between Jewish and Christian worlds, and the flowering of a hybrid culture, mixing Jewish tradition with Venetian aesthetics within the ghetto walls themselves. But during the Middle Ages, cultural and religious boundaries, rather than physical ones, marked Jewish spaces and society. In my brief comments here today, I will reflect on some of the cultural mechanisms Jews of 12th and 13th century Ashkenaz, or more precisely the Rhineland, used to make a fence around their Torah. The clearest expression of this effort to establish a boundary between Jewish and Christian norms is an interpretive method that emerged in the wake of the devastating Crusader attacks in 1096. The school, known as Tosafists, adopted a dialectical interpretive method that relied explicitly on Talmudic precedent and tended to read the law in its strictest sense, imposing the most extreme interpretations possible on biblical and rabbinic precepts. Medieval Jewish communities in Ashkenaz did not live in separate contained walled spaces. As a rule, they lived within the city walls, often adjacent to a church or a cathedral, and in close proximity to their Christian neighbors. Likewise, the central institutions of Jewish life, synagogues, ritual baths, kosher butchers, and the like, were usually clustered in relatively central locations in the city. We know that there were small Jewish communities throughout the Rhineland as early as the 10th century, but the earliest documentary evidence of long-term Jewish settlement is a charter dated 1084 issued by the Bishop of Speyer, Rudiger Husmann, which established for the Jews a designated plot of land situated outside of the city but surrounded by walls, in the words of the charter, for the protection of the Jews. Within this space, Jews were to live according to Jewish law and practice under the guidance of a designated Beit Din, or a rabbinic court. The unique arrangement of Jews living in their own walled city was short-lived, though. Within a few years, the person who followed in Rudiger's place as Bishop of Speyer enacted a revised vision of the city that integrated the Jewish community into the old city walls, an arrangement that was apparently preferable for the Jews as well. And similar patterns of settlement pertain throughout the Rhineland in the Middle Ages. The fact that the Tosafist school arose in the shadow of the Crusader attacks is not incidental. The body of halakha, or interpretation of Jewish law, that this group of scholars produced prescribes a wide array of rituals. I should pay attention to those first letters. That far exceeded the mandates of the Talmud and thus erected formidable social and cultural boundaries between them and their Christian neighbors. At the core of these interpretations is a guiding principle that explicitly encouraged Jews to interpret the law in the most stringent terms possible when relations with Gentiles were in question. In the words of one 12th century rabbi, may he who acts in the most stringent way possible be blessed. In the interest of time, I will focus on two specific cases, halakha governing martyrdom and halakha related to the production and protection of kosher wine for Jews. I'll start with martyrdom. Talmudic mandates regarding murder and suicide are quite clear. Both are strictly forbidden except in three specific circumstances: when the failure to inflict violence on oneself or on another would necessarily result in the commission of murder or adultery or idolatry. Yet a portion of the Jews of Ashkenaz chose to take their own lives rather than submit to the Crusaders' efforts to forcibly baptize them. Some sacrificed their children to assure that they would not be converted and raised as Christians, and then took their own lives. It is clear from the documentary evidence that the number of people who chose martyrdom, or Kiddush Hashem, literally meaning the sanctification of God's name, was actually relatively small. But regardless of the numbers, over the course of the following century, rabbinic sources made a point of justifying this behavior legally with a strong rhetoric that cast Christianity as idolatrous, making martyrdom the only viable halachic response to religious coercion by Christians. While it is hardly surprising that Jews would respond negatively to efforts to convert them, the rhetoric embedded in the Hebrew narratives of these encounters went to great lengths to present Christianity morally and theologically repugnant, and thus rendering martyrdom necessary in times of direct confrontation. Likewise, the Tosafists interpreted regulations governing the production of kosher wine in similarly exaggerated terms. Any wine that was touched by a Gentile at any point in the production process, from the start of the fermentation cycle to the moment the wine touched the drinker's lips, was considered yain nesach, or libation wine, and thus rendered unkosher. Strict observance of the ordinance meant inconvenience, if not hardship, for everyone in the chain of production and transmission. This had enormous implications for the way Jews lived in Christian society because it caused both practical and social difficulties that threatened to upset harmonious interfaith relations. Knowledge of the prohibition generated objections on the part of Christians, as you would imagine, who saw Jews as inferior and thus naturally subservient to Christianity. The Tosafists were aware of an Iberian commentary on this mandate that determined that the regulation could be relaxed if a sweetening agent, like honey, were added to the wine. However, they chose to register they chose to register this particular practice as foreign and said that it did not apply locally in their communities. In both of these cases, the Tosafists chose to interpret tradition in a manner that made perfect compliance quite troublesome. Hebrew narratives valorizing martyrdom were riddled with demeaning caricatures of Christianity, while adherence to the letter of the law of yain nesach would be costly in economic, political, and social terms. So what do the Tosafist efforts to establish formidable cultural and legal barriers between Christians and Jews tell us about medieval fences around the Torah? On the one hand, halakha relating to practices of ritual purity served as a mechanism for demarcating the boundaries between Jewish and Christian cultures, even for, or especially for, members of the two religious communities who lived side by side. And at times, these members of different communities shared domestic spaces and even economic interests. But on the other hand, even as the Tosafist interpreters bent over backwards to build a fence around the Torah, they couched this effort in a conceptual framework and vocabulary that shared basic assumptions about the shape and contours of individual and community sanctity within the Christian culture in which they lived. So they had themselves participated in this culture, and their fences did not necessarily actually have the expected or desired consequence. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Let me bring my... It's right here. Move it. When Will told me, why don't you bring something to the table in terms of the topic, I offered him a number of options to give a sense of what I could do for this. And he chose this one among them, but perhaps less than my colleagues who spoke earlier. I don't actually think of making a connection to the Berlin Wall in such an explicit way. As I was listening, however, I thought that, I nailed it. Eleni spoke about walls that include, although of course that universal democracy is only possible in reference to the barbarians outside. So I would like to look a little bit at what's going on the outside of that universal democracy. Second, perhaps even more important, right to the point of the Berlin Wall, I always was struck, I did not live in Berlin that long, but I live in Constance for quite some time. And there was this is in the early 90s, there was a very strong feeling that anyone with a particular kind of accent, Thuringia, Dresden, is an Aussie. So, although I, from an outside, as an outsider, was seeing all this as a single nation, country, by that, I was struck by how, in fact, a mental wall had been created in the minds of the people on one side that most likely was a reference to the real world. It's just come down in the city of Berlin. So do walls do anything other than create a universal democracy? What's the reaction on the other side with the barbarians? I'm not going to talk about Aussies, but in a way, those are the Aussies of the 6th century. My area of discussion today, so I chose to actually talk about the Balkan Peninsula during the last century of Roman power or presence in that area. It's an area that has been recently the object of much research, specifically for this period on time, because you can tell it's very close to Constantinople. It's a central area for Justinian's mode of thinking about power and restoration of the Roman Empire along the lines of what Eleni was talking about the much earlier time. And literally the geography of the area would tell you why. There's a plain north of the Danube River, which was perceived as the northernmost boundary. I hesitate to say frontier, but there is some discussion about that, whether the Romans in the 6th century had that notion. But beyond it, there's a section of plain that goes eastwards outside the map that you see here, well, practically all the way to China. And indeed, it is this corridor of contact, but also war, that the organization of the Roman administration in the 6th century may be viewed as a response to. Now, my intention is twofold. Number one, I will try to talk a little bit about the walls themselves. Dr. Frye has mentioned walls of cities, and I'm going to show you some of them. But as you will see, although the existence of a wall, like a Berlin Wall, well, actually longer than that, in the 6th century Balkans is quite conspicuous. Dr. Frye is quite right. The discussion about the long walls of Thrace is almost marginal. And there is a reason for that. There are many more, not just city walls, but forts, hill forts, stronghold, a lot of them heavily fortified. So let's start with cities. And I chose to give you two examples here of new cities. In other words, not cities that had a refurbishing and maybe a refortification in the 6th century, Thessaloniki, Salona, or others that existed from much earlier times, but two really 6th century foundations. The one on the left is Tsarichingrad, most likely Justiniana Prima, most likely being Justinian's hometown. He was born not in a town, but in a village. But in order to create a symbol for the magnitude of the power that he was actually yielding there, he established an entirely new city in the middle of nowhere in the 6th century. What is interesting is that the city itself does not have any of the features of the earlier cities of an orthogonal intersectional or network of the streets. Is dominated by a large acropolis in which the largest feature is a very large church. And down the hill from there is the two sections of the lower town, and then outside the walls, as you can see them here, there are quite a number of churches as well. Interestingly enough, Tsarichingrad did not exist for more than maybe 70 to 80 years after its foundation. So all those walls proved to be, I mean, a lot of expense, but did not pay back too much, let's put it this way, whatever their purpose was. The other city is Tsarevets, which is in fact the name of a hill, one of the hills on which the city of Veliko Trnovo, most famous in Bulgaria because it was the capital city of the Second Bulgarian Empire. But underneath it, there is actually a 6th century city, built anew again. We don't know what the actual ancient name of that city was, but as you can tell, it's also an irregular plan. It was not as well and systematically excavated as Tsarichingrad, but it gives you a sense that the largest buildings were also churches. There are examples of cities, ancient cities, so cities with a Roman past, an early Roman past that were transformed in the 6th century. And I want to use this example, Nicopolis ad Istrum, to give you a sense of how that transitions into discussion of forts. What you see on the left side is the plan of the Roman city. Nicopolis, obviously by name, from victory, was actually built immediately after Trajan's victories over the Dacians. So it's a celebration of that. So it's the 2nd century, early 2nd century city. Notice the very regular or orthogonal street grid, which is in sharp contrast with the plans that you saw earlier on. So it's a classical example. It was abandoned in the 6th century. Nobody lived there. Instead, a fort was added to the southeastern corner of the city. And that's the only place that was inhabited. Inhabited, did I say that? Well, not quite. Large areas inside it were left totally unbuilt. And there's speculations, there have been analysis of paleobotanical samples that perhaps the areas inside the walls were used as fields. No, I'm not talking about large-scale agriculture, most likely something along the lines of horticulture, small fields with vegetables and things like that. I'll come to food later and you'll understand the significance of that. How many of those things existed? Well, this is an estimate, but the number of forts built in the 6th century is absolutely staggering. Procopius, in the 4th book of his buildings, which is supposed to be a praise of how great Justinian as a builder was, for this region that I'm talking about, the Balkans, here lists names, 800. But the number of the forts resulting from archaeological excavations is enormous. And as you can tell, this map favors the central area, Macedonia. So just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here, this is where Constantinople is, Thessaloniki is here. The central area seems to be quite heavily fortified, but there is equal lining of forts all down, one next to each other, so within view of each other, so to speak. We're talking about the flat terrain of the Danube plain on the southern bank of the river Danube. Now, as I mentioned, we do have actually an example of a Berlin Wall-like structure. In fact, more like Offa's Dyke in England, if you know what I'm talking about, the wall built by King Offa separating Mercia and the Western Saxons from Wales, except that that's in earth and timber. This is actually a wall not too far from Constantinople, so its defensive purpose is quite obvious. Let's take a closer look to it. So it's actually the map. So Istanbul is, where the actual picture of the wall is where actually the location of the city on the map on the left would be located there. And as you can tell, it's actually a wall from one sea to the other, literally, right? It is mentioned there, I would have actually immediately noted that unlike other walls, this actually is mentioned quite a number of times in the sources. There's plenty of evidence for it. It survived in later centuries as well, more or less in ruins, but in the 6th century it's a phenomenal structure, and it may have been built by Emperor Anastasius in the late 5th, early 6th century. As you can tell, large sections survive to this day. A reconstruction would have looked something like that. In other words, it's a wall, maybe a fort of two, but it's just a wall. In other words, it's a barrier. I don't have any other word to describe what's going on here. There are no gates. The forts themselves would provide access, and obviously they are on both sides of main roads going to Constantinople. But it's meant to stop what? Well, I'll get to that a little later. Let's move now from the south, from the neighborhood, from the environs of Constantinople, back to the Danube line. In the 60s, by the time the Berlin Wall was built, the Yugoslav government decided to actually use the Iron Gates region where the Danube goes through the mountains. It's a, absolutely gorgeous landscape, but where the flow of the water is very powerful. It's used to huge hydro plant there. And in the process, excavated a number of sites. A number of sites were excavated on the right bank next to the mountains there, which proved to be forts. Some of them built in the 3rd and rebuilt in the 6th. Many, like this one here, built anew in the 6th century. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of the fort at Veliki Gradac, we know the ancient name, Taliata, is that in this case, the church is not in the middle, it's attached to the wall. I guess you might say that if anyone would like to actually storm the walls, it will just jump on the roof of the church on the other side. Elsewhere, in the middle of the peninsula, specifically that concentration of dots that you saw on the earlier map, those are massive walls. I mean, in the history of the Balkan Peninsula, after the 6th century, nobody built forts as many and as well built as those of Justinian in the 6th century. Successive powers, the Byzantines a little later, then the Ottomans for sure, rebuilt on top of those walls rather than building new forts anew. In other words, they were almost like their their military thinking, strategically speaking, in the peninsula there in terms of forts and fortification was predetermined by the existence of so many and so well-built forts. The fort at Markovo Kuli is perhaps one of the most interesting. I'll get back to it and you'll see a bird's view of that. I want to point out that those are extraordinary in many respects. The amount of material, I want to challenge you to imagine the amount of work going into actually building those things. They're not built in the plains, all of them. They're built on top of the mountains, some of them, right? How to carry, how to transport all that stone, and so on and so forth. And the innovations, militarily speaking, such as this curious tower in an angular shape at the end of the fort. I'll get to that fort back. Gates are heavily fortified. This is Halmiris or Murighiol in Romania, in Dobrogea. One of the gates of the fort. Excavations right now are run by a Romanian-American team. It's enormous. The amount of work put into actually build this is extraordinary. And just like in the case of Tsarichin Grad, the existence of the fort after the walls were rebuilt and renewed lasted for another 50 years, no more than that. Perhaps Dinogetia or Garvan next to the Danube will actually prove my point. Take a look at the organizational space inside and you'll understand that there's not much room for anything else but perhaps smallest military unit of early Byzantine army, Bandon, so to speak. So we're talking what, maybe 150 to 100 men inside. The very interesting aspect of the Dinogetia there is actually there's a cemetery nearby, the analysis of which proved the existence, or burial rather, of both women and children. So those are not just soldiers move from one point to the other, they live there with their families. Now, as I said, some of them were built at high altitude in central Serbia. Gradina, some will argue this is not even a fort, it's actually a city, but it's built at high altitude and with a number of precincts. As you can tell, there's like in Vichgrad, an acropolis on the highest elevation possible, surrounded by another wall. Inside here, you can barely see it, is actually a church, and inside that church, this reliquary was found. With an inscription, so most likely this is actually a pilgrimage site besides being a military one. I promised we're going to return to Markovi Kuli. Vodno is right next to Skopje. Get a view of the absolutely impressive, extraordinary fortification. But the image in negative there is of three objects, all made of gold, found in a cistern. So, once the water was over and so on and so forth, someone actually hid a little hoard there, which consists of belt buckle, the first one, earrings, and a fibula. One might argue all three, at least two, if not all three, elements of female dress accessories, which again would point out to the fact that this is not just a world of men. Behind the walls, there's a life that actually has a particular flavor. Speaking of flavor and speaking of walls, something that will be probably closer to the length, well, not quite, a little longer, to the length of the Berlin Wall itself, is a wall that was built, like a barrier again, between the Danube and an old branch of the Danube called Mlava at the border between Serbia and Hungary nowadays, at Svetinia, which is not far from the ancient city of Viminacium, Stari Kostolac. Now, as the plan shows, adjacent to the wall, right? So there are no forts. It's just a wall. There's towers there, but behind the wall, on this side, right? There are a number of houses, with sunken floor buildings and with heating facilities and with material and with pottery and with animal bones. In other words, with life. Let's take a close look at that. You're going to see what kind of material is found there. Very interestingly, the heating facilities are made of Roman bricks. Roman bricks brought from Viminacium. Dr. Frye was mentioning the fact that Roman armies coming into cities to destroy baths and amphitheaters and whatnot to get the spolia, the stones to build the walls. Here, the bricks were taken from Viminacium to build ovens, to build heating facilities inside those houses. What kind of people lived here? Well, judging by the material there, those people actually did not cultivate their own food. Remember, I promise I'll come back to food. Amphorae that clearly points to Annona, to, public dole, to things that were brought all the way from Egypt through the Black Sea and then on the Danube upstreams all the way to Viminacium there, through the Iron Gates most likely, navigating up in conditions that were probably quite dangerous, to bring food to those people there. What kind of food? Well, there's a discussion about late Roman II, Carthage late Roman II amphorae being for oil and late Roman I maybe being for wine. I'm not going to get into that, but suffice to say that those are things that arrive there from very far. This is a network, this is an infrastructure behind the walls that is not sustainable without the government being involved 100%. When you take a closer look at other things that were found in there, besides buckles and whatnot, perhaps the most interesting of all is armor plates, which again seem to have been brought from elsewhere. It's not produced locally. There is no evidence of smithies or anything like that. Speaking of amphorae, I want to point out to the fact that we do know from the written sources that this indeed was a structure that was maintained artificially, you might say so. It's a state-run operation of distributing food, because the distribution of amphorae, as you can see, the site that you just saw earlier on is located right here, right? That's where Svetinia is. So the amphora there arrived via the Danube this way, right? All the way from the Black Sea. Constantinople is here. Right? The distribution of amphora in the northeastern part of the Balkans coincides with that of seals of magistrates and other officials of an administrative unit created in 536 by Justinian to take goods by taxes, right, from provinces that are rich but overseas and transport them via the sea and the Danube to the units, military units in the Balkans. Who are they afraid of? Who are the people they are so eager to be closed from? Well, I mean, as far as we know, the barbarians on the other side of the Danube. Our sources do not tell us, obviously. Those will be named, there will be exonyms, there will be names they will attribute to those people rather than names that they would give to themselves. Procopius talks about Huns, and we also learn about Gepids. The Huns themselves are an interesting thing, and I brought this image to show you that regardless of the language group to which we presume they belong, Gepids being Germanic, and Huns being anything Asian, whatever. They actually fought in similar ways, in ways that actually implied what might be called, risking an anachronism here, blitzkrieg. So attacks by force very quickly against a certain point that withdraw as fast as possible. Since the Roman armies are involved in the Mediterranean, conquering or reconquering much of that region for the empire, the only way in which you can sustain such a constant pressure is to close your soldiers behind walls. Because those horsemen don't stand a chance in front of their walls, nor are they interested in any sieges. At a closer look, the situation is, however, even more complicated. There's actually a huge array of names, and we can play like, trying to figure out on the modern map where they are located. They are obviously with different chances of success in identifying those areas. But clearly that this corridor coming from the steppe is indeed the couloir that actually makes it possible for those horsemen, warriors on horseback, to threaten constantly. And if you look a little bit, so, the force that you saw earlier on were on the Danube in this section. If you cross the Danube here, it will take less than a day to reach Constantinople. I'm sorry, to reach the long walls of Thrace, that barrier just in front of Constantinople. The situation got even more complicated by the end of the 6th century after Justinian's death, with a new power coming from the steppes that was able not only to destroy the two enemies caught in an never-ending conflict, the Gepids and the Lombards in the Carpathian Basin, but established in their stead a state that survived for 200 years. It was Charlemagne that put an end to the Avar-Khagan. So, where am I going with this? Well, I mean, then where are the Slavs? Well, they must come from somewhere, and migration is the model that was used so far to actually explain the presence of the Slavs and the fact that from Serbia to Bulgaria, large portions of the Balkans are Slavic speaking to this day. The only problem is that there is no evidence of migration, neither in the sources, none of the authors, including Procopius, who saw them with his own eyes, mentions them as coming from anywhere. And others assumes that you'll understand that they are there. Since when? I don't care. I don't know. Nor in archaeological terms there is any evidence that there is a migration of people, such as this nice general staff map showing the Slavic armies pouring into the core of the empire. Instead, what we have, archaeologically speaking, is a large number of settlements. And each dot would represent anywhere between 15 and 30 houses per sorts of small villages. Do not imagine large communities of people. But it's interesting how their distribution is actually along rivers, right? On both sides of the Carpathian Mountains, but there's a concentration clearly outside, exactly that area that the fortifications in the Balkans were meant to defend. Let me give you an example of just how this is happening. In fact, as you can tell, this is the Danube. This is a settlement excavated, and you can figure out how close from the Danube it is. There were in fact 4 settlements found there within a 3-mile radius, so between 500 and 750, maybe the same community or maybe not, we don't know. 4 villages were created within an area. So a village was established there, after a generation or 2 was abandoned, moving in another place. What caused this? Or is this migration we're talking about? And if so, what caused this? And the answer, I'll give you a sense of the plans of those settlements. This is the first one that was built. That's a kiln right in the middle of the settlement. Each one of those numbers are actually sunken feature buildings. A second settlement created with 2 ovens in the middle and the other houses loosely grouped in a circle around them. The answer to the question what caused this must have been the kind of economy that was practiced. Indeed, without actually fertilizers and rotation of crops, after 5 years the fields are exhausted, so you have to move elsewhere. And you gain that land for cultivation by means of itinerant, quote-unquote, or slash-and-burn agriculture. How did the settlements look like, and what was the kind of life that we're talking about here? Those sunken floor houses must have been quite similar to what you have seen in Svetinia. On both sides of the walls, people lived in very similar, but by our standards, quite poor environments. And what you find in archaeological excavation is indeed a huge pile of stones that will actually mark the heating facility. Remember, those were built out of bricks brought from the city of Viminacium in the case of Svetinia. What does this all mean? Well, I would leave it as a question as to why in so many settlements, on the map that you saw earlier on, at every moment in time, then we excavate, you find pottery, usually handmade, but every now and then there will be a fibula, which will be, if you remember the situation of Markovi Kuli, a female dress accessory, usually worn in pairs on both shoulders. Right? All the time, and there are hundreds of them found singly, 1 in each house. We know for sure that those houses were not destroyed. They were abandoned orderly, if I may put it this way. So it is, and those fibulae, I didn't put a scale there, but they're quite large. There's no way, and shiny. You cannot actually miss them in that little space of the place there. There is some discussion right now that they may have been left intentionally behind to mark the abandonment of the house, either the death of the household, or probably moving them, build another village nearby. But more importantly, they seem to actually create an impression, archaeologically speaking, that those people are actually developing a new identity. What is very interesting is that this is exactly the moment in time, chronologically speaking, 580s, 590s. So let's say 30 years after Justinian's death, Justinian who built the walls, that we can see in fact an ethnogenesis of the Slavs. They appear in the sources as really bent on crossing the Danube and staying there. Thank you.
Well, my walls may end up being a little bit more metaphorical than those that have come so far. But I want to thank Will for including me in the symposium today. And I want to preface this by saying that this is a tiny slice of a larger project that began with an observation
that in ekphrases, extended descriptions of objects or artworks in late antique literature, prose and poetry, gemstones are treated differently than other materials, in a way in which their materiality is very much emphasized. And this is an observation that actually another scholar, Ruth Allen, has recently made for an earlier period and connected to Roman wall painting. But gems and their qualities, visual, magical, and spiritual, play a role not only in late antique novels and epic, and in courtly medieval literature, but also in Christian commentary. Cassiodorus Senator was a court official to the Amal rulers, the Ostrogothic kingdom of Italy, who we've just seen on the map. And in his retirement, the founder of a monastery at Vivarium on the Ionian coast. His writings have been largely overlooked by art historians specifically, but his letters on behalf of the Ostrogothic king Theodoric speak richly to Amal interests in the patronage of art and architecture, and on at least 2 occasions elsewhere, not in the letters, he writes vividly of jewels. These passages, the first from a fragmentary epithalamium, probably composed for the occasion of the marriage of Viticus and Matasuntha, and the second from a commentary on the Psalms that was well known in the Middle Ages, bridge these pagan and Christian traditions of writings about gems. In the longest and best preserved passage of the highly fragmentary epithalamium, the bride is literally and metaphorically adorned by virtues, who then bring Venus out to escort her. The virtues themselves are described in the language of adornment and the toilette. Heavenly chastity placed on her brow like a diadem, rosy modesty painted on her cheeks like rouge. But the bride's own inherent charms, of which those virtues form a part, are also described as set off through the more literal contrasting effects of various colors and jewels. The virtues veil her with green, illuminate her with lamps, whiten her with sapphires, and darken her with pearls. And in the end, the dressing of the bride in colorful garments and gemstones as in virtue is described in terms of the setting of a jewel, pearls enclosed in golden bezels whose annular form is then multiplied into the shape of a crown. But the bride is praised not only as an object of beauty, but also as its agent. She is credited with having built a palace, which itself is the gleaming setting that will reveal her true nature, the transcendent beauty of her immortal soul, to the masses. One where, quote, "The surface of the marbles gleams with the same colors as gems, scattered gold glows, and all is adorned with metallic colors." In her role as builder, Matasuntha is compared to the legendary queen Semiramis, who built the walls of Babylon, as well as, just before the fragments cut off, the Persian king Cyrus, who constructed his house with, quote, "gold and a variety of stones, gathered and bound together." The surfaces of Matasuntha's palace walls, like those of her person, reflect, offset, enhance, and outwardly project her virtue as a wife and as a ruler in the language of gems. Cassiodorus's aborted ekphrasis of the palace of Matasuntha, like his description of the bride, carries echoes of Claudian's epithalamium for Honorius and Maria, where Venus's many-colored palace shines and glitters, built of precious stones and gold. In the goddess's palace, columns are cut from rock hyacinth, and they support emerald beams, the walls are of beryl, the thresholds of polished jasper, and the agate floor is trodden like dirt beneath the feet. But these descriptions also call to mind, the description of Matasuntha's palace also calls to mind the scattered gold and metallic colors of the mosaics that survive to us from 5th and 6th century Ravenna and elsewhere. We might think, for example, of this image of the port city of Classe in Sant'Apollinare Nuovo, which shows the city walls as constructed in gleaming gold brick. Or more tellingly, perhaps, of the representation of the palace that faces it across the nave. On the facade of the palace, the pediment and the spandrels of the arcade are articulated in golden tesserae that are just marginally bigger than the golden specks that compose the background atmosphere, or the white tesserae of the marble columns. The mosaic artist thus cleverly conjures the representation of mosaic ornament, winged victories, hanging garlands in the spandrels, and undulating tendrils in the central lunette. And I think you can see this contrast best in the archway on the far left. The play of real and fictive bleeds into the atmospheric gold of the background, used to conjure light, air, and limitless spatial depth. In the 5th and 6th century mosaics of Italy, just as Alexei Lidov has argued in a number of recent articles, it does in later Byzantine mosaic icons. This is part of a rethinking of Byzantine art, not as flat as we understand it, but rather as extremely spatial. And nowhere is the play of fictive and real in color and light so acute in early medieval Italian mosaics as it is in depictions of the bejeweled walls of the heavenly cities of Jerusalem and Bethlehem. The two cities, their walls adorned with rows of gems, are a commonplace in the spandrels of triumphal arches. In Ravenna, we find them at Santa Apollinare in Classe. And I gather that the mouse doesn't work very well, but we're looking just here and there where the sheep are coming out of. Sorry, I stepped away from the microphone. At Santa Apollinare in Classe, where the disciples rendered as sheep are streaming from the jeweled walls of the cities, perhaps looking up towards the Pantocrator, flanked by the symbols of the evangelists. Below the disciple sheep are reduplicated as witnesses in the apse itself, with Santa Apollinare in the center, to the jeweled cross that is simultaneously a uniquely abstracted representation of the Transfiguration and a harbinger of the apocalypse. The two zones of the mosaic are simultaneously divided and united by the jeweled border that articulates the apse. It's gilt. Let's see if we can zoom in a little bit and see more clearly what we're looking at here. It's with the red background. Its gilt setting bleeding into the atmospheric gold that pulses between heaven and earth. The jeweled border, and here I'm looking, especially up here. Oh, again, sorry, the thing doesn't work. But if you go straight up from the jeweled cross, that's the zone I'm talking about. The jeweled border both underlines and continues past the lower row of sheep, where it also articulates a row of windows. So the windows are framed with this jeweled border as well. The gemstones, with a kind of glittering realism, literally tie heaven to earth, both thrusting upward and descending all at once. A similar material and spatial theme is at play in the apse of San Vitale, where the jeweled walls of the heavenly cities fold into the jeweled border that defines the crease of the wall in real space. You can see that at the very top of the image on the left side above the arch is the heavenly Jerusalem, and then the red background jeweled border running down the crease of the wall. In both these cases, this one and the previous one, the gold background of the city walls suggests the possibility of a dematerialization into the heavenly gold atmosphere, a visual trick that is arrested by the literal materiality of the gems that also provide the visual link between heaven and earth, the kind of path that we can trace. We could turn from Ravenna to Rome and adduce many further examples, from the east-facing triumphal arch at San Lorenzo fuori le Mura to the dizzying spectacle of Santa Maria Maggiore. To turn back to Cassiodorus for a moment, he deploys language similar to that of the epithalamium, rosy richness, chaste purity, in his commentary on line 127 of Psalm 119. Therefore have I loved thy commandments above gold and topaz. He gives little attention to gold, but lingers over the nature of topaz. He writes at first of what is said of the precious stone, but his commentary quickly mingles encyclopedic reportage with vivid descriptions of not only the stone's qualities, but the effects of those qualities. It attracts the most eager pleasures of the eye. Cassiodorus's commentary, like the jeweled mosaics, also foreshadows some of the richest medieval writing on gemstones, commentaries on the stones of the heavenly Jerusalem, as described in the book of Revelation. We can take, for example, Bede's commentary on Revelation, in which he offers an expansive allegorical reading of the precious stones. He proceeds stone by stone, opening his discussion of each with the physical qualities from which arise first visual impressions and then spiritual meanings. The light of chalcedony becomes the flame of a lamp, and then the shining virtue of the righteous. The green of emerald is the green of growing things, and then souls flourishing in faith, like fertile flora. Bede is building on encyclopedic and medical traditions to create a new and influential form of exegesis. But like earlier writers, he grounds his reading of the meaning of the stones in their appearance and materiality, which give rise to mimetically suggestive imagery. In Bede, that imagery in turn allows for the Christian allegorical explanations. But turning back to the mosaics, we can see that through their depiction of the materiality of gemstones, their light and color, these mosaic borders, which are periodically revived at Rome, such as in the 9th century Santa Maria in Dominica, or the 12th century San Clemente, both with and without the heavenly cities. They suggest a literal fulfillment of the promise of Revelation in the construction of the New Jerusalem on earth, turning the walls of the church itself into the space of the heavenly city. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Will, for inviting me to the event. Now, the extant Great Wall of China was rebuilt in the Ming Dynasty. I show you several maps. This Great Wall, and this is clearer. But especially here, we can see the double layer walls of all those regions. This is again, this is double layer wall of all those regions, and this is this region, and now. Within this region, the city Lanzhou is important. This is Chinese there. The Lanzhou in Gansu province was situated at the northwest edge of Ming China, neighboring Mongols to the north, various Tibetan tribes to the south, and many Muslim and tribes and states in the so-called western regions. It was a military strategic point. Lanzhou was also an important road between China and the West, not the Chinese term northwestern region, but the west to China. To the north lay, to the north of Lanzhou, the city there. This is This is the Lanzhou. Okay. To the north lay the Yellow River, and the Ming Dynasty Great Wall cut through Lanzhou city on both sides of the river. That's why the double layer wall. Because the Great Wall was crucial to the Ming state for both military and economic reasons, the government built, restored, and renovated this section 18 times from the early Ming to the Wanli reign period. Some parts of the Lanzhou was situated north of the Yellow River and became targets of a Mongol attack. At this point, the Silk Road split into 3 ways, one of which led through Lanzhou to cross the Yellow River. Is a crucial point on the way to the China's far western area and Mongolia. Lanzhou played an important role nationally and internationally. During the Ming, diplomats, merchants, and distance travelers passed through Gansu province to Beijing, many of them staying in Gansu to engage in commercial activities. In addition, the Ming government set up horse trading offices, chamasi, on the northern and northwestern borders to regulate the sale of tea to nomadic Turkish and Tibetan-speaking peoples in order to acquire horses for the Chinese military. And these chamasi offices are located at Great Wall. Lanzhou and its neighboring areas had several such offices. Lanzhou thus became the tax center for collecting tea submitted by merchants for the horse trade. While the significant number of Turkish Tibetan-speaking peoples and Chinese Muslims in Gansu, with them in Gansu, Tibetan Buddhism and Islam were and are still the 2 strongest religious traditions there. Yet, for non-Muslim Chinese, religious Taoism has also been important. As early as 265, the Great Peace Monastery, Taipingguan, was built in Didao, the area neighboring Lanzhou. From then on, Taoism spread throughout Gansu province. During Ming times, Lanzhou patrons would have had many choices of a preferred temple to receive their benefactions. The Chinese Buddhist monasteries, Tibetan Buddhist monastery, state and popular religious temples and the Taoist temples. I gave you the figures here in Lanzhou. In the Ming, princes and the military aristocrats played an important role in disseminating traditional Chinese religions, including Taoism. Indeed, in the frontier regions, where many aboriginal peoples were concentrated, and some forms of so-called foreign religions, such as Islam, Tibetan Buddhism, or indigenous religion proliferated. These Ming princes and aristocrats in charge of the frontier affairs more than likely advocate Taoism as a sign of Chinese identity, in addition to the official and in this region often ineffective Confucian ideology. The feature of the religious landscape of the region is. Except the big cities such as Lanzhou, there were few Chinese Buddhist temples. Instead, the majority are Islamic mosques and Tibetan Buddhist monasteries. In other words, in this region, because of the concentration of various ethnic minorities, there were a lot of Islamic mosques as well as Tibetan Buddhist monasteries. Those who believed in Islam were mainly Hui nationality and some other minorities, while those who believed in Tibetan Buddhism were Tibetans and other minorities who were not Muslims and few Han Chinese. This set a limitation of Taoism development in this region. But this limitation, as we just mentioned, at the same time provide an advantage for Taoism. In the mean, Chinese Buddhism was active in the population center of Han Chinese of this region, which also witnessed the proliferation of Taoist activity. As opposed to the hinterland China, Taoist institutions in this region were more numerous than Chinese Buddhist monasteries. The situation of Chinese Buddhism in this region was weaker than Taoism. Relate to this, most Han Chinese in this region preferred Taoist temples to Chinese Buddhist ones. This was because in this region, the main form of Buddhism was Tibetan Buddhism instead of Chinese Buddhism. Or Tibetan Buddhism, to a certain extent, pushed aside Chinese Buddhism. In fact, the decline of Chinese Buddhism and the proliferation of Taoism there was caused by ethnic and religious reasons, in addition to wars and natural disasters, such as the migration of Tibetans and the founding of Tibetan Buddhist monasteries. Before the Ming, many Chinese Buddhist monasteries actually were converted to Tibetan Buddhist ones. Due to Islam's monotheistic nature, Han Chinese usually did not believe in Islam. As a result, many Han Chinese went to Taoist temples to pray. In other words, although there were some ethnic minority patrons in these Taoist temples, the majority of their patrons were Han Chinese who were marginalized by Tibetan Buddhism and Islam. Taoism and the Taoist patrons existed in the Han Chinese community. Whenever a Chinese needs a ritual for any purpose, he or she would hire Taoist priests for that. In this sense, Taoism and Taoist activities became the Han Chinese identity and cultural legacy. This was also Taoism's strategy to survive in this ethnically diverse region. As a result, we see the ethnic and religious interaction along the Great Wall in this region not seen in other parts of China. This image is a Taoist Abbey in this region, Tulou Abbey in Xining, but the style, architectural style, is Tibetan. This is another Taoist temple, Taoist city god temple. As Dr. Frye just mentioned, the Chinese city god, right? Taoist city god temple in Huangyuan City in Qinghai. The brackets, so-called dogong, the brackets is decorated in the Tibetan style. Again, it's decorated in Tibetan style in this Taoist temple. Now, in this region, as I've just mentioned, there were many, and there are still many Islamic mosques. In addition to the mosque, the Kaaba, that's Arabic, as translated into Chinese as Gongbei, are tombs of masters and saints. They are major places of worship for the Sufi order of Chinese Islam, and they were and are still more secret than mosque. Now, this is one of the Kaaba in Lingsha. Actually, I can show you the image at the location of Lingsha. You can see this is Lanzhou, this is Lingsha, very close. Lingsha is China's so-called China's Mecca, the most secret place for Chinese Muslim. This is one of the Kaaba Gongbei. This is called Gongbei. But in this Kaaba, we see the Chinese Islamic art of brick carving on the wall of Kaaba. It's very popular religious art in that region. More, then we can the lower image. We can see the Islamic icon here. But also, it's interesting. The Islamic art of brick carving also involves some other religious elements. For example, the Chinese language here, the Taoist expressions of on the left, 太史, the original commencement, that is a Taoist idea, but they incorporate the Chinese Muslim incorporated into their brick carving on the left, right? On the right, actually, is the plaque. The plaque of this Kaaba has this language. The first character is Dao. Dao Qi, the Qi of Dao, the Qi of Wei. That is Daoist expression. Certainly it's a Daoist expression. That means the Qi of Dao still exists. So you can see they adopted the Daoist expressions there. And another one, it reads, the same goal by different means, all roads go to Rome. So that means different religions have the same goal. This is over there I saw this Chinese Muslim calligraphy. This left side is calligraphy, meaning the tranquil oneness. That is a Taoist idea. But if you see the stroke, this one, the stroke, it is Chinese character, but within Chinese character, this Arabic. There are many Arabic. Now, this brick carving, Islamic art of brick carving, but this is not on the Kaaba. This is on the Taoist Abbey, Taoist White Cloud Abbey in Lanzhou. They adopted the Islamic art of brick carving, and even hired the artisan, the Muslim artisan for that art. Now, there's another, in that region, there's also another very famous monastery, Tibetan Buddhist monastery, Labra Monastery. This is one, and it was one of the 6 great monasteries of the Galang school of Tibetan Buddhism. Galang school was the dominant Tibetan Buddhist form. Labra stands for this monastery, very famous one. But Labra in Shah, Labra also stands for this area. This is a place name. Now, just in this area, there is a Taoist temple, Guandi temple. This Taoist temple, who built it? The temple was built by the Labra monastery, by the Tibetan Buddhist monastery, to build this Taoist temple. For what purpose? For the Han Chinese to have a place to pray. And you can see the temple name plaque. It's written in both Chinese and Tibetan. It's built in the early Qing dynasty, the 17th century. Now, this is another Taoist abbey. Over there are so many patrons when they are during the season. We see the many prayer slips. But if you read very carefully, the slip, Taoist temple, right, slip with writing in Tibetan and the Tibetan Buddhist images at this Taoist abbey. So I think, so these images, to conclude, so the Great War of Ming functioned as a separation, and from which we see, as we mentioned, limitation, right? But at the same time, the Ming Great War served as a convenient spots or sites for interactions between the inside world and outside world of the Great War, economically, religiously, and ethnically. In that sense, the war is a tool, as Professor Frye calls, facilitated unintentionally and ironically that kind of cultural exchanges. Thank you.
Now it's my turn, right? To see if I can synthesize something. I think, if I'm not mistaken, we are close to our concluding time. So if I have this correctly, what we might want to do is I can do some concluding remarks and throw some things out there for synthesizing. Am I correct in terms of the...
I think that would be a good idea. Yes.
Right.
I think you all are going to pull the plug at 7-ish or so?
If we go beyond 7, I would be in charge.
Oh, okay. All right.
Well, I will keep this. I first of all, I want to thank Will for inviting me. I don't, as I say, I don't get around much anymore. But I also wanted to apologize for being late. International Studies was having their reception today. It had been postponed because of Hurricane Dorian. I've lost track of them. Dorian. And so it was something that I felt deeply committed to, and it seemed like a great preface for these talks. And it's so nice to be surrounded by my friends and colleagues. So while you were all talking and I was actually engaging my intellectual muscles, as atrophied as they may very well be, some thoughts came to mind. And first of all, there were such beautifully crafted papers, and the thought that struck me is that walls are essentially lines, right? And most of the walls that we talked about today were built long before we imagined the globe as striped with lines of longitude, right? So now when we close our eyes, we picture the globe as actually covered in lines and walls and borders that mark our east-west divisions and stand in as avatars of time. And yet, even before we imagined the world this way, because I'm pretty sure they don't actually have the stripes on the ocean, but we imagine it this way, it's because we have imagined walls, lines, borders, limits, margins, dividers, definers, all of which mark the interiority, the exteriority, foreign, non-foreign, east, west, north of the border, south of the border. And so they exist really as a graph, from my perspective, of telling us where we are. Even before we had a global perspective, we had that local perspective. And these are all human-made. Other than rivers, these are things that we create out of our own minds. We've got to build that wall. We have to put this wall in this particular place. And so I thought of Nina's point about the community that was walled in Frye, and then got walled in by bigger walls. So the walls within the walls, and of course that's where we are right now. Walls within walls, confines within confines. So we know that we're on one side of University Avenue or the other, right? On one side you can have a church, on this side you can't have alcohol. And so there are all of these defining characteristics. And so walls protect those who are within, but it also confines them. It allows for a concentration of an idea, but at the same time confining. And so the walls themselves, being two-sided, are in many respects icons of themselves. And then the last point that struck me was the whole idea of the wall as the word I used in my notes was foundations for cultural expression, one side or another, right? So, you know, Richard's point about the decorations of the wall, your point about the borders that visually link heaven and earth together, but we use these to decorate them. Eleni, I think it was yours, the Gainesville Wall, right? The walls in Pompeii with the graffiti on them. We see a wall, we have to decorate it. So not only does it define, but then we define the wall. So I thought, first of all, Will is always this wonderful source of intellectual stimulation, as are all of you as part of this moving, synergistic, continuing symposium. So I like this idea of ethnogenesis, that these walls create us even after we've created them. We define ourselves, and then you see this in Berlin, right? I'm East German, West German. No more iconically than with that whole idea of the wall, which is now gone and is simply a line on the road, right? So these walls that stand as avatars of borders, but equally ways in which we define ourselves, not just simply through the building of them, but the imagining of them. We imagine them, and then we build them. They get torn down, we remember them. And so in that sense, they also continue as markers of time. Apropos of which, are we still within 7?
There's no rush. Take care of
But that's really what I have to say, and I thank you all for opening up my mind, which otherwise is pretty much closed off by my skull, right? So even our own little worlds within our minds are there's walls. We talk about the cranial wall, right? All of this. So
and the within, right?
Right,
Hemisphere, left
right. The
hemisphere.
within and beyond, and just one remark. When I first started spending time in Rome, and there were those churches, the Fuori le Mura, that actually was and then the first time I ever saw an English translation of that, St. Paul without the walls. And I thought, very interesting. To be on the outside is to be, I know it's a bad translation, but that whole idea of within, beyond, one side, the other, foreign, non-foreign, but on the other side, and this was your point, on the other side of the walls, they see what is within as foreign. So there's a Janua, a Janus aspect to all walls. I'm rambling because I'm excited. You've excited me. I think we got to keep working on, not necessarily tearing down walls, but maybe building doors through them, and putting in a few windows. Thank you.
Thank you. I am not going to try to follow up on this. I'm gonna leave. I think, Mary, thank you so much for pulling things together so nicely. There's just a few minutes left, and rather than try to engage in questions that would even begin to get into the complexities of the different things that you all have been talking about, I want to draw attention again to the fact that this is an online enterprise where we have, in fact, all of this is recorded, so we have all of these talks, and there is the possibility online to engage in further discussion. I will set up quite a Q&A discussion type setup for the talk, so that if anybody cares to come back to it and look at one of the other talks and pull things together, that will be there.
Yeah.
And I will invite students also, because we have students. We received some online questions. Unfortunately, I think now for Q&A, there hasn't been enough time for Q&A, but I don't regret it at all. I like having all of this, all of these different perspectives of pre-modern walls. And as material, so to speak, and it's there, it's preserved, and we can come back to it, we can look at it and ask ourselves questions about it, and compare it, and see where we can take that. So instead of all of that, what I wanted to do, getting back to what I wanted to do, was thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for being involved in this. I think that this was a tricky enterprise. We tried to do a lot, I think, and I like to think we did a lot. The discussion part, the sort of the German Auseinandersetzung, where we pull all of this together. It's still possible, I think. It takes a different form.
Publish it.
And that's something like this. We have the second part of the symposium, the Modern Symposium, in November. So it's not like our business is finished either. So thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.